Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is the Honorable Louise Arbour. Madame Arbour was the UN Special Representative for International Migration. Before that, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And before that, she was the Chief Prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. She served 5 years as a justice on the Supreme Court of Canada and also on the Supreme Court and Court of Appeal for Ontario. In a lifetime of service, her mission is to promote and protect human rights for all people everywhere. Madame Arbour, welcome.
Thank you.
How did you become so passionate about human rights?
I think it's all law. You know, it's all starts with my fundamental trade, which is the law. And my original interest was in criminal law. And so that brings you pretty rapidly, I think, into human rights issues, you know, protection of vulnerable people, including people accused of crime. So I think it was an evolution. It's not, I can tell you when I was in law school, there was no such thing as human rights law. You know, it just came, it developed in the course of my career. But I think it's anchored in my sort of general background in criminal law.
Well, there was a quote, and it's a quote that you provided, I think, at one of the honors you were given from a cleric, a 19th century cleric. And you probably could speak it along with me, but it says, between the rich and the poor, between the strong and the weak, between the master and the servant, it's freedom that oppresses and the law that sets us free. I think people would be surprised by that. Why does that mean so much to you?
Well, I worry sometimes that people talk about things like human rights or the rule of law, not having really much of a sense of, you know, it's kind of a good thing, but what exactly is it? And to me, that quote captures exactly, in a very simple way, what the rule of law is all about. You know, between the rich and the poor, the strong and the weak. It's freedom, unbridled freedom, that can lead to oppression. And it's the law's mission to set free. That is, to create an environment which equalizes these differences and reduces the chances of abuse and oppression. So the rule of law, for a lot of people, they think it means rule by law. You know, you should have laws to govern conduct. But it's a lot more than that. It's not any law. It has to be laws that are just and that are justly enforced. It takes away arbitrariness. It takes away the potential for abuse of power. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a very simple way of capturing the essence of what a society ruled by law, by just laws, is all about.
So what made you so strong? Was it 10 years at a Catholic girls' school in Montreal?
Well, that had obviously a huge impact. I'm sure a lot of it positive, but when I reflect on it, I think I've spent the rest of my life running away from that kind of environment, which was essentially a very homogeneous environment. And I didn't realize at the time, but I spent the rest of my life craving differences. Different people, different places.
Well, you obviously love challenges, because I mean, I'm thinking you studied civil law in French in Quebec, it then clerked at the Supreme Court, but then came to Ontario, learned English, and taught common law. So it was like, whoa, there's a challenge.
I like novelty. I think it's very awkward. I'm not very introspective. Mm-hmm. I never left anything I was doing because I didn't like it or because I was bored. I'm not easily bored. On the other hand, I can't resist. If something comes up and it's new, even though I'm objectively not all that qualified to take it on, like working internationally, I'm easily intrigued, let's put it this way, and ready to go.
Well, and opportunities have presented themselves to you. I mean, obviously, apart from academia, which was great, and then the Ontario Supreme Court and then the Court of Appeal, all interesting, huge careers. But then the UN job came up as special prosecutor for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the war crime tribunals. Were you astonished? What did you make of that job?
Well, first of all, it was not at all what I thought it would be. First of all, it was very new. Huh? This had never been done since essentially the Nuremberg trials, an international criminal law venue in which heads of states, military, and political leaders could be brought to account before the world. This had never been done. It had been talked about for years, and I think it's unimaginable we'd see that again today. It's essentially the Security Council of the United Nations agreed to create these two tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. And when I saw that, I never thought in my lifetime that criminal law, which was my discipline, would have an international reach. When I got there, it was extremely operational. It was not an intellectual laboratory. It was deploying people to investigate with basically no blueprint, no template, no handbook on how we're going to do this. I mean, on a typical day, I would have, first of all, in my days, it was mostly investigations. We had just started trials, but it was mostly investigations. But everything I knew about investigating crime in a Canadian context was about police powers. So they have the power to wiretap. They have networks of informants that they could rely on. We didn't have any of that. We were investigating massive crimes in countries in which we didn't know the culture, we didn't speak the language, we didn't have networks of informants, we didn't have powers of arrest or search. So it was, you had to think from first principles, be very strategic, and be willing to take a lot of risks.
Mm-hmm. But this, and as you say, mass murder, rape as a weapon of war, ethnic cleansing, and you were in the field and trying to sort through this as well.
Yeah, very, and of course, not just me. I mean, the tribunal was growing, but when I arrived, already had a core of investigators that came, many from the US, and they were very good, and then a handful of people who had done, in a domestic context, had done war crimes investigation, meaning old Nazi war crimes, from Australia, from the UK, from Canada, people who, but that's very different. I mean, this was investigating historical events. We were now dealing with a conflict that was still brewing and unfolding.
And Slobodan Milosevic was a sitting, head of government, and you were indicting him and trying to, bring him to justice.
Yeah, well, he, I'm sure, thought that we would never reach him. I never met him. I went to Belgrade many times, but I knew I was going to indict him, so I was very keen to avoid the inevitable, embarrassing handshake. So I figured, may as well. It's not going to be any point talking to him anyway. He's not going to tell me anything useful. But I'm sure that he never, ever thought that this would happen to him. And it happened essentially when his power base internally collapsed.
What was your end feeling about what you were able to accomplish?
It's very difficult to measure, what we thought then and what we see now. When this was all unfolding, I think we had some naive expectations that this was part of the never again.
Prevent all further atrocities.
Yeah. They'll be so scared.
This was a warning to all heads of state and heads of government. They would never do this.
No.
They'll be hauled up before.
They'll understand now. Yeah. They can be made accountable. And this, I think, in retrospect, confirms what I believe also domestically, which is that there is a limit to deterrence as an objective of a criminal justice system. The reason people commit crimes is not solely guided by their anticipated fear of punishment or fear of being caught. And the reason people don't kill each other is not because we have a law against murder. It's because we have a shared understanding as a society, right? Now, there's some deviance, and that's why I think the death penalty, for those who argue the death penalty on the basis of deterrence, is completely misguided. There's, in my opinion, no evidence whatsoever that the anticipation of being caught and severely punished has a large impact.
So you look at Ukraine, for example,
Exactly.
and shake your head.
Well, and before Ukraine, I mean, between these tribunals and Ukraine, there's a lot of conflict. There have been many in Africa, there's Yemen, I mean, there's Syria. And we have the International Criminal Court, which is sort of the legacy, the follow-up on these two ad hoc tribunals. And still, it doesn't mean that it's not a good thing to have the court, but we cannot assume that its main function is exclusively deterrence.
So while you were in the role of special prosecutor, you were offered a position on the Supreme Court of Canada. And so I think, to the surprise, you said, of many of the other people involved in these investigations, you said, "Oh, I have to go back, take this job." It's not one you turn down.
But that's really interesting because, of all the lawyers that I worked closely with in those days, the Europeans, all my European colleagues, whether they were from Denmark or France, they were astonished that I would consider leaving what they thought was the best law job in the world, like prosecuting war criminals for the UN. There's nothing better. The ones who got it were the Americans. Of course she has to go. You don't turn down an appointment to the highest court in your country. And the US Supreme Court, the composition and so on is just the same, 9 judges. So it's only them and the Canadians, obviously, who understood that, yeah, I had to go back.
And you served 5 years, but then you left before retirement age. Again, how did you make that decision to go to the UN again as the High Commissioner for Human Rights?
I have to say, not lightly. It took me a very long time to come to terms with the fact that I could leave. It's not a life sentence. And, I had known Kofi Annan. He was asking me to come back and work with him. And so first I told him, I can't leave this particular position, which I liked, actually. But then it just kept rolling in my mind, oh my God, this would be so much fun. Going back on the international scene, and I could see with his backing, I figured the Human Rights Office had a reputation of being a bit sleepy and not all that well managed, and I thought, maybe I could go fix that.
It's interesting that you say that you thought it might be fun, because I mean, you've been described as paying a heavy price there. That it was hard work and a hard time, and you didn't pull your punches. You didn't pull your punches against America, what you saw happening in Guantanamo. This is 2004, war on terror time. You didn't pull your punches on Israel and what you saw happening in Lebanon, for example. You were called anti-American, you were called anti-Semitic. You were attacked a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As we move into these different venues, there's a loss of innocence, I think, each time, whatever innocence is left by the time you move in these kinds of circles. But you make assumptions that sometimes don't quite work out. It was a very difficult time because, the U.S., which can normally be relied upon as, on good days, a real champion on human rights issues, on a less good day, maybe somewhat indifferent, but in that particular period of time, it was openly hostile, I think, to any form of international scrutiny or criticism. And yet it was a time where the U.S., I think, was on a very bad path of questioning even international norms, like the absolute prohibition on torture. It's not that it's complied with everywhere, but it's accepted that torture is not acceptable. And then, of course, there's deviance. The US was actually openly questioning, well, you know, there may be times where it is appropriate. No, it's not appropriate. And so it was particularly challenging because one of the great champions of civil liberties, human rights, fundamental freedoms was actually, as I said, in the 4 years that I was the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I visited, I don't know, I made 80 trips. I went to Russia twice, I went to China. I could never secure an invitation to make an official visit to the US. They were always busy. Every time I asked the US ambassador, it was always, well, the secretary is very busy. Well, that's fine. Can we block like 5 or 6 potential target dates? Anyway, it never worked.
Wow.
Until I went. In any event, what I did is I called, actually I think the first person I contacted was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I thought, well, I'm a former judge. Why don't I just go to the US and visit my fellow judges? So I told the ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, I have very good news for you. I will not harass you to try to get me a date for a visit with the Secretary of State. I'm just informing you that I'm going to the US and I'll have lunch at the Supreme Court and probably visit a few people on the hills. What? No.
So
anyway.
you just, well, you know, I guess you've made a career of just working around things, figuring it out.
Yeah, and not in a very in a hostile, aggressive way, but you know, it's my job. I have to find ways in a very polite and, yeah, just have to get it done. But so it shows, I think, where America was in that period of time and what it meant internationally not to have the support of such an important anchor of these values.
So you think of all these things you've done and seen, you know, do you have a dim view of humanity? Do you think the arc of the moral universe bends in the direction of justice? I mean,
no, I think that contrary to what I assumed until relatively recently, I think everything is cyclical. Maybe because of the era in which I lived, for a long time, I thought we were on a course of improvement of, you know, the position of women in society and respect for minority rights and the erosion of dogma that came from institutions that were set in their ways, like in my case, the Catholic Church. Anyway, I saw a lot of progress that I thought was going to go forever on the pathway to eternal happiness. Now I think things are cyclical. The only thing that's hard to judge is where we are in the curve. I mean, have we reached the bottom? Is there going to be a swing back? What is it going to look like? And the impact of things like, well, technology, artificial intelligence. I'm very optimistic. I look at my grandchildren and I think, oh my God, I wish I could do it again. Yeah, no, there's no reason, I think, to despair, even in the face of, in some cases, pretty abominable setbacks.
You're so results-oriented. It's interesting that, you know, you support and believe in the UN. A lot of people look at that body and go, really? You know, it just...
Well, maybe they don't know. If you think of the UN purely as a political body, and unfortunately, that's a lot of what we see in the news. Oh, the Security Council failed to agree on a resolution on Ukraine. So you see all the politics of it. Well, you know, it's the old saying, it's like dogs dancing. It's not a question of how well they're dancing. We should celebrate the miracle that they're dancing at all. Would we be able today to create a forum where every state in the world has an equal seat at the table? I don't think so. So we should already, you know, agree that that's a good thing. we've just had an agreement, took 10 years, an agreement on protecting the biodiversity in the oceans. After the Montreal Agreement on biodiversity generally, now we've targeted the high seas. This, it's in the news for not even 24 hours, it disappears. This is a lot of accomplishments, not to mention the role of all the agencies. They're out there. They're not seen on a daily basis, whether it's the World Food Program or UNICEF or the High Commissioner for Refugees. They operate, camps for 70,000 people, whether it's in Darfur or in Bangladesh for the Rohingyas. But the UN is a huge presence in the world that works
and a force for good, you think?
Yeah. And it works in a very diverse workplace environment. You have to work there to see what it's like to work on a daily basis with people who don't look like you, who come from a very different place, but, can march to that drummer. Mm-hmm. It's great.
And, because you've worked for them again, in terms of migration as well. We look at between conflict in the world and climate and all the things that are happening, migration will continue apace, at the pace it is now.
There's no question. It will become easier to move. It's easier through communication technology to see what the options are. So there is no reasonable expectation, I think, that people will revert back to staying where they are. So I think dispelling the negative mythology about migration already goes a long way. And I think the exercise of this global compact was very good for that, just to put in the public discourse some of the elements. First of all, that when people move, they move close to home, right? Not the whole world wants to come to America. Most people, given the choice, are very happy to stay where they are, and if they can no longer stay there, can no longer make a living, raise their kids, get them educated, get a decent health care, they move first within their own country, somewhere else. Then they move next door, in the region, right? And the economic pulls and pushes that regulate that environment are very poorly understood. Poorly understood how the West and developed countries need and rely on immigration, including on the presence of irregular migrants to work all the informal economy that contributes to a lot of services being cheap because these people are underpaid. And
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, all these aspects were important to bring to the surface.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for you? Do you just sort of, the phone rings and you're off?
Yeah, well, I turn it off. First of all, I always joke that I'm working very hard at trying not to work at all, not very successfully so far, and in the end it's not true. I have now, I think, the last big thing I did that took me very full-time 1 year was a review of sexual misconduct and leadership in the Canadian Armed Forces. And that sort of, that big chunk of work, as long as it's finite, I'm prepared to do some work, but I wouldn't embark on some amorphous, long, demanding enterprise. I'm with the law firm, so I still have my fingers in the law, which I like. Still enough travels, so I'm good.
So the final question is, what does being Canadian mean to you?
Canadians sometimes have a very romantic view of our place in the world. That as long as you have a Canadian flag on the back of your backpack, all doors will open and everybody loves you.
We're nice.
Oh, yeah, we're nice and we matter. But I think when you arrive internationally, you realize that there's the way people look at you also inform what you think of yourself. And then it becomes a little more challenging to live up to our internal conception of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
We can do more.
We can always do more. And Canada has a role to play internationally?
Yes, yes, but like for instance, on this migration issue, Canada was there. It should have been there with a megaphone, because internationally, rightly or wrongly, we're viewed as the all-time success story when it comes to immigration. Well, we were there, I would say relatively timid, not with the kind of megaphone that we could have taken on that particular issue. So we could do more.
Yeah, well, and your work is never not done either, obviously. It's great that you're still so engaged by so many things, and we're grateful for that and all your work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciated your time.
Pleasure.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Tony and Sherry Fell, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, Michael McCain and family, Jim and Sandra Pitbledo, David and Cheryl Carr, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Charles and Marilyn Bailey, Richard Pilasoff, Clench House Foundation, Kathy and George Dombrowski, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.